Today we're going to be learning Beitzah Daf Lamed Bet. We're going to start off where we finished yesterday with a little bit of review. So Shmuel had said, he was talking about fastenings on the floor that are for caves or doors or cellars. So chotamot shebakarka, you can be matil, avalo mafki, avalo chotech. You can untie them, but you can't unravel them or cut them. V'shebekelim, but if they're of vessels, utensils, like a closet or something smaller, matir umafkia v'chotech. You can untie them, unravel them, and even cut them. Echad Shabbat, echad Yom Tov. He makes no differentiation between Shabbat and Yom Tov. Keep this in mind as we go on. To which the Gemara questioned, but wait, it says in a Beitzah, chotamot shebakarka, one's on the ground, b'Shabbat matir, avalo mafkia v'lo chotech. That matches fine. But b'Yom Tov, matir umafkia v'chotech. You can do all three on Yantif without a problem. That goes against what Shmuel said. So the Gemara had answered, oh, don't worry, that's Rabbi Meir, who had said, af pochet l'chatchila v'notel. The rabbis disagree with him. It must be the healed by the rabbis. The bright tells like Rabbi Meir, all resolved. However, even though Rabbi Meir, the rabbis didn't exactly say what they hold about that, to which the Gemara says, but wait, we know from another Beitzah that the rabbis specifically say exactly like Rabbi Meir does in terms of that they agree with him, that matir avalo mafkia v'chotech, and the b'yom tov matir mafkia v'chotech. So again, we're back to square one. He seems to match this Beitzah, which then goes against Shmuel, and Shmuel has no one to hold by in the Tannaitic time period. To which the Gemara says, remember, you don't want an Emora disagreeing with what the Tannaim say. So they say, there's a third Tannaitic opinion. Huda amal ki hai Tana, he holds like the following Tana. It says in a Beitzah, chotamot shebekarka matil, avalo mafkia v'lo chotech, echad Shabbat, echad Yom Tov. This Beitzah sounds perfect for Shmuel. Here's another Tana who says the fastenings on the ground, you can untie, but you can't unravel or cut. Whether it's Shabbat, whether it's Yom Tov, it's exactly what Shmuel said. Perfect. However, the end of that Beitzah is not so perfect. Because remember, what did Shmuel say when it came to Yom Tov? You can look at the chart also. When it came to the vessels. Chotamot shebakarka, b'Shabbat matil. I'm in the wrong place. Chotamot shebekelim, matil umafkia v'chotech, echad Shabbat, echad Yom Tov. Shmuel had said on the previous stuff that when it comes to Shabbat or Yom Tov, the halacha is the same, both for the vessels and for the ones attached to the ground. It's just that we're going to differentiate between the ones attached to the ground and the vessels, but not between Shabbat and Yom Tov. Here it says in this Beitzah that we want to say matches Shmuel's opinion. V'shebekli b'Shabbat matil, avalo mafkia v'chotech, u'b'Yom Tov matil mafkia v'chotech. This Beitzah, though, that we want to say Shmuel holds like, is stringent when it comes to the kli on Shabbat. The fastenings on the vessels on Shabbat also can't be unraveled or untied. Okay, only on Yantif you can do it. So teratz telecharesha ela sefa kasha. They said you've explained the beginning of the Beitzah, meaning you've taken this opinion, you've matched it to Shmuel and said, oh, Shmuel holds like this, but only the first part and not the second part. So they say, don't worry. Hamane Rabbi Nechemihi. The second part, and what's the difference between the second part of Shmuel and the second part of the Beitzah? Second part of Shmuel permits everything, Shabbat and Yantif, when it's on the vessel. The second part of the Beitzah only permitted Shabbat, not Yom Tov. So now why? Only permitted Yom Tov, not Shabbat. So why would we make a distinction? It has nothing to do with the issue we've been discussing. It's a separate issue. Hamani Rabbi Nechemiah. The issue where he's stringent about Shabbat has to do with this opinion of Rabbi Nechemiah about Muktzah. We've been talking all along about Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda, and Muktzah. But if you remember, when we learned Masechet Shabbat, there was a third opinion about Muktzah. It was a very strict opinion. But we have Rabbi Shimon who's very lenient. We have Rabbi Yehuda is much stricter, has much more things that he considers Muktzah. But this is Rabbi Nechemiah who's the most stringent. What does he hold? Ta'amal. Kol kelim ein nitalim ela derech tashmishan. If you want to use any utensil, it has to be used only for its typical purpose, what it's meant for. So a knife would not be able to be used to cut on Shabbat because it's not its typical use. You don't normally use a knife to cut these ropes. It's not what they're used for, right? They're used for cutting other things, not ropes. So therefore, we're going to say the reason why they're stringent in this Mishnah has nothing to do with the issue in the Beitzah, has nothing to do with the issue that Shmuel was discussing. It's a separate issue. You can't cut them because you can't use a knife. That's the issue. So now they say, wait, but that doesn't make any sense to say that. Because again, that Beitzah, to say that Beitzah is holding by Rabbi Nechemiah when it comes to Muktzah, and that that's the issue there, That's only, and then only Shabbat, not Yantif. Well, that's what the Gemara is going to ask. Rabbi Nechemia is strict about muktzah, whether it's Shabbat or whether it's Yom Tov. And if you want to say Shanya le Rabbi Nechemia ben Shvut Shabbat l'Shvut Yom Tov, if you want to try to suggest that maybe he differentiates and he's much stricter about muktzah, his strict laws about muktzah are only for Shabbat and not by Yom Tov, you can't say that. Umi Shanya le, does he really distinguish? And now we're going to prove that it seems clear that Rabbi Nechemia is strict about Yom Tov as well. Because what we're going to do is we're going to bring three Beitzah, which seem to all contradict each other. And the Gemara is going to resolve it by saying, one's Rabbi Nechemia, one's Rabbi Yehuda, one's Rabbi Shimon. And the topic of that is, what can you burn? What can you use for burning, for your kindling wood? Where can you take wood from? Or not wood, it's going to be broken vessels that they're using for kindling. Now, you obviously don't kindle on Shabbat, so the subject must be Yom Tov. And yet, we're going to see that Rabbi Nechemia is very strict when it comes to Yom Tov as well. In which case, we're stuck back with, well, then why, if it's really Rabbi Nechemia, why would he distinguish between Shabbat and Yom Tov? But before we get to an answer, let's read the issue here. Doesn't it say in one Beitzah, you can light your fire with vessels, because vessels aren't muktzah, but you can't use broken vessels, because broken vessels are muktzah, because they're not usable. Another Beitzah says, you can light a fire with vessels or broken vessels. Or the third one, you can't light you can't use for your fire not real vessels and not broken vessels or regular vessels. Umishane, and the answer given to resolve the contradiction, as I already told you, Lo Kashya HaRabbi Yehuda HaRabbi Shimon HaRabbi Nechemia. The one that says you can use regular vessels but not broken vessels, that's Rabbi Yehuda, who holds muktzah but not to the extreme. Rabbi Shimon says you can use even broken vessels because they're still usable, right? They can be used for that, so he's going to be very lenient. And Rabbi Nechemia is going to say not even regular vessels, because you don't normally use vessels. That's not the purpose of the vessel, is not for kindling. So therefore, you can only use it for its typical purpose. And this is on Yantif, so clearly he's strict about Yom Tov. So how do we resolve it? No worries. Trey tonight, Valiba de Rabbi Nechemia. There's two different Tanaitic opinions about what Rabbi Nechemia held. One held that he held it was even on Yantif, and one was that he didn't hold it on Yantif and only on Shabbat. In which case, we resolved Shmuel, how he works out with originally the original problem, which is nobody seemed to hold like him. Oh, he holds like this third opinion that appears in the Beitzah, and the end of that Beitzah happens to hold like Rabbi Nechemia when it comes to muktzah, but that's okay. Shmuel didn't hold that way, so it was fine. New Mishnah. There's a bunch of different interpretations what this means. We'll go with Rashi. Rashi explains it's actually very interesting. He says you take an egg of a smith, okay, which is not a real egg. It's like an egg shape, and you put it into the clay to basically make a hole, like a circle, an empty space. An indentation would be the word I'm looking for, to make the nair. Remember what a nair is? It's a little clay. It's made out of earthenware, where it's got a little bit of depth to it. You put the oil in it, and then you put the wick in there. My kids used to make it in Ghana, and I'll tell you a story about that. It'll be relevant to our discussion later. So you're not allowed to press in and make that indentation to make the hole, to basically turn it from a flat piece of clay or a round piece of clay, right, into a vessel, because that's basically creating a kli, making a vessel. That's what the Mishnah says. You can't make charcoal, because again, you're creating something. You can't cut the wicks, because that's also preparing them for being used. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer, if you want to cut the wicks, what you can do is you can light them. And then that basically cuts it. Like take a long wick, light a fire in the middle of it, and then you split it into two. The Gemara is going to have to explain why does he think this is okay. So first the Gemara asks, Mantana Depritat ner manahu. Who's the one who says that once you make that indentation into the clay, it's a vessel? Right? Imagine you're at some pottery studio, or you're making some vessel, and just by making the shape, it's certainly not ready. You have to put it in the oven, in the kiln. It's not going to be prepared yet. So who's the one who says that this is actually making a kli when you're not even really finished? So Amar Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yosef says we're going to see two different versions of Rabbi Yosef. In the first version, he says it's Rabbi Meir. Teitanya's, it says in the following Beitzah, Kli cheres, me'matay mekabel truma. From when is a kli cheres, an earthenware vessel, from when is it considered a vessel that is susceptible to impurity? Remember, once something's called a vessel, it already becomes susceptible to impurity. That we assume is therefore going to be the same concept of Shabbat or Yantiv. Once you make a kli, right? If it's called a kli, then you've made something. So he says, so Rabbi Meir says when it's finished, the work is finished. The work is finished before you put it in the kiln. Putting it in the kiln is not work. Just put it in the kiln. Rabbi Yeshua says once you burn it in the kiln, then it's prepared. So Abai says, why are you assuming that Rabbi Meir there matches our Mishnah here? Because there's a difference between making a vessel and making this little clay thing for the candle. Why? Once you've made that shape, right? Imagine you're in a potter's thing and you make this bowl and you didn't put it in the kiln yet. The truth is already, it's big enough, you could put things into it. But this little candle, it's very small. That's why I remember when the kids came home from Gan, it says it's a teeny thing. It's smaller than the palm of my hand, basically, or about the size. So when you have something like that, I mean, obviously it can be different sizes, but something so small like that, what's it going to be usable for? It's not usable at all. It's only going to be usable once you go put the oil in. You can't put the oil in till you run it in the kiln. So therefore, it's useless. So what do they answer, right? But here, what could you possibly do with it? This is why I remember when my kids came up from Gan. You'll see why in a minute. You can put some coins in it, right? What happens in my house? The kids come home with these things, right? And nobody really uses it for anything. It's right. It's this little piece of clay, right? That my kid doesn't want to throw out. Ends up on my counter. What ends up happening? Any little things end up going in there, right? And it collects beads that are laying around the house or pieces of the kids' toys that got lost or a die or, coins, any little thing that's laying around that becomes a receptacle for it. So it does have a purpose, and therefore Rav Yosef is right that we could say this matches Rabbi Meir's opinion. Some people say that Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yosef said, oh, this matches Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadok's opinion, not Rabbi Meir's opinion, second version. Ditnan ilpis in chiraniot, which we're going to see what they are assume, which is they're going to call them in the Gemara, they're pots that people, or these vessels that people used when villagers use them. Okay, what's the deal with villagers? Well, villagers don't really care. They're not very particular about, right? They don't have fancy pots and pans and dishes. So they'll use anything. This is really supposed to be a pot. So it comes up in some sources. They say you would basically create it in the Yerushalmi, it says, with its cover on, and only later you would take the cover off when you buy it like that, you take it off. So it was useless until you took off the cover. But these people in the village, they would use it like that. It didn't have a receptacle. Remember, in order to be a kli, it has to have a receptacle. So according to Tanakama in this Mishnah, they can't become tamei in an ohel, right? Remember, there's a dead body in a tent or in a house. Everything becomes tamei, but only vessels that are susceptible to impurity. This is not. But when it comes to masa azav, if a zav carries them, then it's going to be susceptible to impurity because you don't need a receptacle for that. That's what Tanakama holds. Even for zav, it's not considered susceptible to impurity. Why? This is the key word, because it wasn't finished yet. Presumably, he would hold that if it was finished, if it already, right, when as Rashi says, what's missing here? You didn't do the chakikah, you didn't make an indentation for the hole, for the pot, and you didn't put it in the kiln. So according to Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadok, all you needed was to make the hole, and then it would be fine. It would already be a vessel and be susceptible to impurity. And for our purposes, it would be forbidden to do on Yantiv. To which Amalei Abaye, same thing now, because it's the second version. Abaye's questions could be the same question. Right? That was a big thing. So once you make a receptacle, it already can accept items. But what's this relevant for? Which again, the Gemara answers, to put coins in there. That has a use. Tanu Rabbanit, the new Beitzah. Okay, you can't make the nair, you can't create the candle, right? The indentation, and you can't make ilpasim chiraniot b'yom tov. Again, this would be making the hole, right? You can't do that. He says they're allowed. My chiraniot. The Gemara wants to know what is chiraniot. Okay, I already explained to you, but that's because I explained it for Rashi based on the Gemara by the continuation. Amar Rav Yehuda iraniot. So that doesn't really help the Gemara. They say my iraniot. What does that mean? Amar Abai tzai chakliata. Tzai means plates. Chakliata are of the farmers. Farmers are the villagers. It's the plates of the villagers. In other words, they use these as plates even though they're not finished at all. Ve'ein osin pchamim. So now the Gemara says, Pshita l'may chazi, why would you be allowed to make charcoal and do something with the charcoal on Yantif? There's nothing you can do with them on Yantif that's permitted. They're useless. To which Tani Rabbi Chia, lo nitzracha ela lemoschan le'ol yarin lebo bayom. You could give it to the ol yarin. These are the people who are heating up the water in the bathhouse. You could give it to them to use for heating up the water in the bathhouse on Yom Tov. To which the Gemara says, Ubo bayom mishare. Wait a minute. What can they do in the bathhouse to heat up water? They can't heat up water on Yantif for bathing. That's not permitted. So the answer, just as Rabbi answered elsewhere, they were heating up the water not to bathe, because that's not allowed. You can't heat up water to bathe on Yantif. You can bathe, but you can't heat up water to bathe. But you can sweat. And that's before they instituted Gzera. People would go to the bathhouse both to sweat, like a steam room. People would go to steam, and they would also go to bathe. You were allowed to heat up water on Yantif for the purposes of steaming, not for the purposes of bathing. But then the rabbis instituted Gzera because people saw people doing this and they thought they were bathing. Because of that, they forbade also steaming. And so Rava says this Mishnah must be referring to heating up the water for steaming. And they will have to tell you, you can't make the charcoal because you might have thought you could to use, and that's what would the purpose be? You might have thought you could do it to use in the bathhouse, to heat up the water for steaming before they instituted this Gzera where they forbade it. But the fact is you can't. Okay, even before the Gzera, you weren't allowed to use because again, you can't make pchamim. It's because you're making a vessel, a utensil. So now we want to deal with Rabbi Yehuda who permitted it with a fire. What's the problem with using a knife? Because you're creating a vessel. Well, same thing with the fire. Why should it then be allowed? So Tani Rabbi Chia brought a Beitzah that says, what you would do is you would take two candles, two of those vessels we've been talking about, fill them with oil, put the wick, this long wick, half on one side, half on the other, and then light it. Then you're basically lighting it to be lit. But in the process, you're actually also splitting it into two. Therefore, it's allowed. Amar Rav Natan bar Abba Amarav, remember his name. So we're going to then see a bunch of other statements that he made that are seemingly disconnected. Mochatina taptila b'yom tov. You can do what's called mochatin to the wick on Yom Tov. To which the Gemara asks again, my mochatin, what is that? Amar Rav Chanina bar Shlamya la'aduye choshcha. It's to remove the charcoal at the top of the wick in order to make the flame shine better, right? To light better. So you're allowed to do that. Tani bar Kapara. Bar Kapara brought a Beitzah with six things. Shisha dvarim ne'amur b'ptila. There's 6 halachot about wicks. Some of them we've seen, some of them will be new. Shlosha lahachmir v'shlosha lahakel. 3 we're stringent about them. 3 are leniencies that relate to wicks. Lahachmir. First, we're going to start with the stringencies. Ein godlin ota lechatchila b'yom tov. You can't weave the wick, right? Normally, you'd intertwine wicks together. You're not allowed to do that on Yom Tov. That's basically creating it. You can't singe it with fire to basically prepare it for being lit. And you can't cut it in two. That's the one we saw before in our Mishnah. Lahakel, here are the leniencies. If you want to form it into a shape and you do it by hand and you kind of smush it down and it's an atypical way of doing it, you're allowed to do that. And you can soak it in oil in order to make it prepared for lighting. And you can light it, you can cut it by putting a fire, right? Putting it in 2 candles, as we saw before, lighting the fire in the center, and in that way you can cut it. So that's the leniencies. Another statement, as I said before, Amar Rav Natan bar Abba Amarav, he said in the name of Rav, Atire Bavel Yordei Gehenom. This seems seemingly unrelated. The rich, wealthy people of Babylonia are evil people. They deserve to be put in hell. Okay, they're Yordei Gehenom. They're going to hell, basically. Why are they so bad? Well, he says, this guy Shabtai Bar Marinus shows up on the scene. Ikla leBavel, he shows up in Bavel. He wants to get involved in some business with some people. He asks, can I join your business? Can I invest? Can I this? They wouldn't let him. So in the absence of work, what did he do? He said, well, okay, if you're not going to give me a job, well, then I need staka, mizone. He asked for some food. Mezanami lo zaininu. They wouldn't give him staka either. They wouldn't give him any food. So Amal, he said, Hane me Erev Rav Ka'atu. These guys must be from the Erev Rav. Who are the Erev Rav? Those were Egyptians that left Egypt with the Jews when they left Egypt, and they became part of the Jewish nation. But they still had their old habits. And therefore, these people must be from the Erev Rav. They clearly can't be Jews. It's a pasuk in Dvarim, Deuteronomy chapter 13. God will give you rachamim v'richamecha, and will have mercy on you, and you will become merciful as well. And from here we learn, if you have someone who's very sympathetic, he must be Jewish. Okay, this obviously isn't meant to be understood literally, that really anyone who's not, right, are we trying to say all Gentiles are not Rahmanim? No. But what it's trying to say is that Jewish people have an inherent sense of Rahmanut. And the people who aren't must not be Jewish. But again, I don't really think that's what they're trying to say. What they're trying to say is that Jewish people that should be Rahmanim. And if you're not going to be that way, well, you shouldn't call yourself a Jew. Okay? In other words, there's certain traits that we assume Jews all have. And if you don't have them, then we're going to treat you as if you're not a Jew almost. And what he's saying is, I can't understand these wealthy people in Babylonia. They seem to have no Jewish roots. They don't have what we normally associate with Jewish people. And what he's really doing is he's really using this language. Again, this language is very not PC, as you would say, but it's not meant to be understood that way. It's meant to be a criticism of the Babylonians and what was going on in the wealthy Babylonians. And get your act together. This is not appropriate, what goes on here. Again, it's interesting to try to think about how these connect to the sugya that we're learning. I don't have a good answer for that, but you can think about it. Okay, now he's going to say some more statements. Okay, anyone who has to go to someone else's table to eat, right, and he's looking for food. I'm going to check one thing in the translation here. I think it is... Okay. Right. Yeah, I was trying to think about, it's not clear whether they're giving him food or not, but the point is, even just having to go to your neighbor's table to get food, that's as if your world has closed in on you, right? That your world is darkened, right? It's a pretty miserable situation to be in. We all know what it's like, or we don't know, but we might know people, or we have been through this ourselves. How hard it is when we can't afford to live, right? Can't afford to buy food for your house. That's the worst feeling ever. Okay, well, we're going to talk about some other things that might be just as bad. And you might agree or disagree with the Gemara. I'll leave it for you. So how do we know that olam chashach ba'ado, that the world is kind of darkening on you? Shenemar noded hu lelechem ayeh yada ki nachom biyado yom choshech. Okay, he's looking for bread. He doesn't know where it is. This is a pasuk from Eov. Makes sense, right? Eov is all about suffering. And Yadaki Nachom biyado yom choshech, he realizes that the dark day is coming. Rav Chisda Amar af chayav einam chayim. He says, not only is it like a day of darkness, but his life is not really a life. This isn't a way to live. Tanu Rabbanan. This is what you might agree or disagree about. Be prepared. Shlosha chayehem einam chayim. There's three people who their life is not really a life. Number one, ve'eluhem. That's already what we discussed. You have to go to your friend's house to eat. You can't afford your own food. Number two, Mishi ishto moshelet alav, one whose wife rules him. Okay, you might find this interesting, right? I assume what they mean is an extreme case of a woman who's incredibly domineering and takes over everything, and right, doesn't let her husband make a decision about anything. Right? We all know women, maybe ourselves, who are a little bit domineering and take charge, and it's known that often women are like to do things their own way. And maybe you could say that this is, maybe we all do this to a certain extent, and it's not always so easy for our husbands. So maybe that's what they're getting at. But I think what they're talking about is a more extreme case, right? Because this is really bad, right? You have no life when your wife rules over you. And someone who's suffering in his body, right? You're sick and you have a disease. Again, very terrible, right? When the disease eats away at you, you know how you don't have any quality of life. Some people add, if you only have one article of clothing. What's the problem with that, right? The problem with that is obvious. Well, not obvious, but in those days, they had to clean. First of all, it's obvious you can't clean your clothes, right? Because you never have anything to wear. But the problem with cleaning your clothes, we're going to see, is that they had lice in their clothing and they couldn't get the lice out if they were never able to take off their clothes and clean them. And then you're like really lice infested, and that's disgusting. So Tanakama, why don't they mention this? He says, while your clothes are on, look at them, check for lice and take the lice out of your clothes. You don't actually need to take them off. Mishnah, right? They don't exactly talk about how gross it's going to be wearing dirty clothes, right? Another separate problem. Mishnah. Okay, the way they would roast fish so as not to burn it, they would put a piece of paper underneath. Imagine something like parchment paper or something like that. Or I'm sure they didn't have parchment paper, but something like that. And they would use a shard of earthenware to put underneath. Right? Like sometimes you bake fish on a plancha, right? What do you call it? Plancha, I think. Piece of wood or something. So you can't break a piece of earthenware vessel to basically to create something to put the fish on, or cut this niyar, this paper, whatever this paper was exactly, because it's, again, creating a vessel. Ve'ein gorfim tanor v'kirayim. You can't sweep out the ashes because the ashes are muktzah. Once you've cooked in there, they're useless. Aval mechabshim, but you can flatten them down if you need the space. You can't take two barrels, put them near each other. Let's say you don't have an oven, like burners to cook with. So what do? You create your own. You take two barrels, you put a little space in between, you put the fire in the middle, you put the pot on top of the two barrels, and there you've created an oven. You can't do that because you basically created an oven. We'll see this more tomorrow in the Gemara. You can't lean a pot that's not stable. Lean it up against a piece of wood, or like a twig, a chip, a wood chip, and a door, or against a door maybe to keep it straight. We'll see exactly what the door means. We'll see what the Gemara thinks, and then the Gemara will change it, but we'll get to that tomorrow. You're not allowed to direct an animal with a stick, right? Often people do that. Can't do that on Yantif. For Rabbi Shimon Matir, he permits it. So now let's go back to the beginning, breaking the cheres and making the paper. My time, because you're making a vessel. Ve'ein gorfim tanor v'kirayim. Tani Rav Chia bar Yosef kamei de Rav Nachman. Rav Chia bar Yosef brought a Beitzah in front of Rav Nachman. Ve'im yafshar le'efot elem kein gorfo mutar. If you can't bake without sweeping the ashes to the side, then you're allowed. Okay, if it's for ochal nefesh purposes, you can do it. We're going to see some stories about this. To be to Rabbi Chia nafala aricha b'tanora b'yom tova. The side of the oven fell off, and one of the pieces off the side fell into the oven. And right then it had all these pieces in it that are muktzah. What did he say? I want some good bread today. He was trying to tell her, therefore you can move all that stuff out because it's going to affect the taste of the bread. He said to his shamash, Tvi, right, his helper, guy was cooking for him, Tvili bar avza, roast me up a goose, the izda, or a duck, the izdahar mecharocha, and be careful of it getting burnt. Okay, again, if you have these pieces of broken shards or something, piece of broken tanor or something else in the oven, like maybe even the ashes, it might burn it. Okay, I talked about my pizza oven that my nephew and my daughter made when there was a closure in the beginning of Corona, and always the ash collects there. And if you don't move the ashes out, you taste the ashes in your food, and it's disgusting. So you can understand why moving the ashes would actually be very relevant, and would affect your food. Amar le Ravina le Rav Ashi. He says to Rav Ashi the following: Amar lan Rav Acha mehutzel, demar sharken le tanura b'yom tova. He said, Rav Acha from Hutzel told me that you, Rav Ashi, that's Mar, you, Rav Ashi, would plaster shut your oven on Yantif. How could you do that? How could you knead the plaster? That's like kneading. It's forbidden to do that. Amar le ana alachta de platz samchinan. I didn't make the plaster and knead it all together. I took stuff that was on the banks of the river of the Euphrates, and I took it from there, like the mud there, and I used that. I didn't have to create it. So now he says, and by the way, it's only if you designated it from before. Otherwise, it's muktzah, because no one ever uses that, right? So you'd have to have designated that stuff from near the Euphrates that you were planning to use it before Yantif, then you could use it to seal off your oven. There's a lot of debate about what this means. Simple reading is ashes are permitted. Permitted what? Some people say mixing. Rashi says it's mixing the ashes with water. That's permitted. Why is it permitted? Because it's not considered lash. It doesn't get to that same consistency as kneading something like the plaster. That's something different. You can't take these two barrels and then put the pot on top and the fire underneath. The outhouse would have rocks there that you could use for sitting on. So you're allowed to take two rocks that are there, designated for this purpose, and you can move them into place and sit on them to use them as a toilet. So Eitive Rabbi Rav Nachman, he says, why? How can you possibly say this? Look at our Mishnah. It says, so how are you allowed to do that? It's the same thing. You're basically creating like almost like a tent type thing, right? You're creating like a chair. How can you do that? So he says, no. There you're basically making a tent. You're putting two barrels with a fire in between and then a pot on top. That's like a formation of an oel, a tent, right? Building a tent is always more of a problem than building something that's not a tent, because again, building is really building a house, a structure. So Amalei Rabbi Zutra le Rav Ashi, right? When you do the stones in the bathroom, you're not making any sort of tent-like structure. So Amalei Rabbi Zutra le Rav Ashi. Wait a minute. You're going to say any kind of building that's forbidden has to be a form of an oel. So if I build an itztaba, like a stand, where it's, let's imagine like a step filled in, no tent. What? I'm allowed to do that because it's not bonet. What are you talking about? Of course it's asur. Can't do that. So Amalei, hatam binyan keva asrat Torah, binyan arai lo asrat Torah. Really, when it comes to something that's permanent, like a step, let's say I build this itztaba, the stand. Of course, it's going to be forbidden. That's a binyan keva. That's something permanent. But binyan arai, temporary, you're actually not forbidden to do. So theoretically, the oven and the bathroom you could do. However, gazru rabbanan al binyan arai mishum binyan keva. The rabbi said you can't do a temporary structure because you might come to build a permanent structure. But when it came to the bathroom, so you have self-respect and you have something to sit on, the rabbis said, we didn't forbid it in that case. Okay, last line for today, Amar Rav Yehuda, Hai midorta, a midura. If you want to build a bonfire, how do you do it? Right, you normally build a structure of wood and then you burn it up. Building that structure of wood is like building a tent. So if you want to build one in Yantif, milamala lamata share, milamata lamala asu. It's forbidden to build it from the bottom up because that's the normal way you do it. If you build it from the top down, how do you do that? Well, one person holds the beams, another person holds the beams underneath, another person holds the beams underneath there, and then you put the bottom ones down, and then everyone kind of drops theirs. That's a very strange way of doing it. That way it would be permitted. Any other way it would be forbidden. With that, we'll finish for today. The sentence actually continues into tomorrow's daf, which is a Beitzah, we'll get to all those tomorrow, what that means. Have a Shabbat Shalom or Shavua Tov.